We take our money for granted. I mean, we don't see it a lot of times unless, of course, you deal in cash pretty much exclusively. But for the most part, it's just a matter of swipe your card, write a check. Maybe some people still do that. But we don't really think about what's happening until you start to notice that your money is not purchasing as much as it used to, or it's not as secure as it used to be. Canadian truckers could probably tell you a thing or two about that. We're going to talk about sound money policy for the state of Idaho. And I'm going to tell you about a conversation I had with a young man who knows a lot about that in just a few moments.
Press Club or bias all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Well, Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
dark money is influencing policy in our state.
Well, that's not how this works.
Welcome to Nowhere to Hide. I'm Brian Hyde. Twice a week, I get a chance to sit down and go through some of the stories that don't get the coverage they deserve, or should we say the coverage that we deserve from legacy media. And money is one of those issues. I don't know if you've noticed, but when you go to the grocery store, it can be a little bit of sticker shock. I was walking through the grocery store yesterday with my wife, and she pays attention, but as we're walking through the cereal aisle, I heard her say, wow, $6 for a box of this particular kind of cereal. I know we're feeling it in many other areas of our life. Everything is more expensive, and yet few people really understand what exactly is happening. Why is it? Why are prices going up? Is it just greedy companies? Is this, what do they call it, brutal capitalism, as the New York Times might portray it? No. The purchasing power of the dollar is decreasing because of monetary policy, and in particular, fiat currency. So with that in mind, yesterday, I also had the opportunity to have a conversation with a very brilliant young man by the name of Nicholas Kleinworth. Nicholas is an analyst for the Idaho Freedom Foundation, and I'm going to share with you some excerpts from an op-ed that he wrote for bitcoinmag.com. And this is Bitcoin Magazine, I should say. I want you to be able to check this one out for yourself. This has actually been brought up at the national level at the GOP convention. There was a lot of interest in sound money. And I don't think it's by accident. This is not just some ploy. This is how the Republicans are going to hoodwink, the voters. It's something on a lot of people's minds because everybody feels the pinch. Nicholas's article says, as DC adopts sound money principles, states must continue the lead. And believe it or not, there's some opportunity here in Idaho that we could see our state level leaders make a difference. So let's dive into his article, and he kind of spells out where this comes from. Now, this month, he says the Republican National Committee released a draft proposal for changes to the party platform that would assert the party's stance against a central bank digital currency, also known as a CBDC or digital dollar, in support of the right to mine, own, and privately transact in digital assets like Bitcoin. Now, the big problem with a CBDC is that it is centrally controlled, meaning if someone wanted to, hypothetically, if someone wanted to use money as a means of controlling the populace, just for instance, they put a social credit score that's attached to that money. The government could reach into your account anytime it needed to extract taxes. No more filing your tax returns. Hey, that's great. But the downside is anytime, hey, we need more money, basically they're reaching into your pocket and taking it, whether you want them to or not. Now, again, going back to the Canadian truckers, did you see what happened to them when their prime minister panicked, wet his pants, and faked COVID so he didn't have to be held to account for his, unconscionable COVID lockdown policies? But he also encouraged the financial institutions to go after the bank accounts of those truckers and the people who donated to help support them. And we're not talking, this was not some terrorist cell that was moving its way across Canada, but they were treated as if they were. This is the same kind of danger that would come with a CBDC. Not a good idea. That central control, especially government control, gives you a system much like what is being tried right now, piloted in China, where a person's social credit score, meaning their ability to prove to the government they're a good little boy or girl and are following all the directives of their leaders, that's what their money is contingent on. You can spend it if you do this, if you reduce your carbon footprint, if you don't drive this many miles or eat this much red meat. Not a good idea. Let's go back to Nicholas's article. Now, he talks about digital assets like Bitcoin, and this is something that's very poorly understood, but it's not like it's incomprehensible. Only nerds can understand, what cryptocurrency is. You just have to be willing to do a little bit of research on your own. Back to the article. Sound monetary policy has been a growing focus of the 2024 election as Republican candidates like former President Trump and Vivek Ramaswamy publicly supported digital assets, specifically Bitcoin, while denouncing the implementation of a CBDC. Even independent presidential candidate Robert F. Kennedy Jr. holds a similar stance on these issues. They're reading the room and saying this is something that matters to people, not something that the control freaks in both the Democrat and some in the Republican Party might tend to see. Nicholas says, as fresh as these issues may seem at the national level, states have actually been in discussions over sound money for some time. The Idaho Republican Party was the first to add pro-digital asset, anti-CBDC language to a major state party platform. And the GOP also considered two bills during the 2024 legislative session that would have fulfilled that pillar of the platform, but ultimately failed by close votes in the House and Senate. By the way, why do you suppose that was? Well, it's because banks understand that with central bank digital currencies, yes, they're still very much in charge because essentially they've partnered with government, much as they've done now. For instance, you withdraw a certain amount of money over a certain threshold. What are banks required to do? Go ahead, say it with me. Well, they were required to report it to the government as something suspicious. Okay. With Bitcoin and other cryptocurrency, you don't need a bank. The bank is a middleman that is no longer necessary because there is a secure ledger that cannot be faked, that cannot be altered. And that's how you transact with people, wherever they happen to be. So the banks want job security. They want government to run interference for them, so to speak. This is one of the reasons why they lobby against these kinds of bills for sound money. Nicholas tells us, though Idaho still faces roadblocks, other states have successfully enacted sound money policy in recent years. Florida passed legislation to ban CBDCs. North Carolina and Arizona considered similar legislation that ultimately failed. Meanwhile, Wyoming, Montana, Arkansas, Oklahoma, and Louisiana all passed legislation to defend fundamental rights on digital assets. Now, these policies come as states attempt to stem the threats to Americans' liberties posed by private banks and the federal bureaucracy, particularly where those two lines cross and banks become a part of that federal bureaucracy, if only by becoming enforcers. Nicholas tells us financial institutions are the new scene of the left's cultural warfare. We actually talked about this a couple of episodes ago. Many banks are ending their business with certain religious organizations, firearms manufacturers, or non-green industries. They use ESG guidelines to justify this. Now, this can be crippling in a modern, mostly digital economy. It also threatens agriculture, mining, and energy, which just happen to be some of the leading industries in Idaho's economy. Nicholas tells us privacy is also a chief concern for many Americans. The federal government weaponizes its power over the banking system to search citizens' transaction histories without a warrant, despite this infringing on the Fourth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. Remember, that amendment was written to restrict government, not to grant you a pre-existing right to privacy. That was yours all along. Government just needed to be reminded to keep its fingers to itself and keep its prying eyes out of your business unless probable cause exists that you're part of a crime. Worse yet, he says, bureaucracies in Washington, D.C., being dissatisfied with their existing degree of outsized control, want to monitor and control every American's financial transactions through a central bank digital currency. This new digital dollar could offer unparalleled control through programmable issuance, use, and taxation. Again, it's a great idea, very convenient, until you realize it puts control in somebody else's hands. And if you don't control your money, then it's not really yours, is it? Moving on. Nicholas tells us it's worrisome that bureaucrats want even more control over a financial system they already proved they cannot manage well. The hidden tax of inflation is devastating the savings of all Americans who use the dollar as a store of value. Yet the government continues to borrow and print to sustain its ever-increasing size. And it still has as much of a spending problem as it ever had, which never seems to be its problem because it can always shake the taxpayers down for a little bit more. Nicholas tells us states that have proposed and passed legislation to protect the financial liberties of their constituents recognize these problems and are acting accordingly. They're providing a way for the market to escape from a financial system that is no longer private, stable, and free. Now, he says, even if sound money policy advances at the federal level, that's not going to relieve the need for the states to act. States that don't yet have these protections still need to continue to advance these policies locally. And there's always the chance they'll be needed to interpose themselves between the federal government and their citizens. Idaho should catch up to her peers by executing its own sound money policy agenda. And he says this starts with acknowledging that a CBDC is not money, and banning the state's cooperation with the Federal Reserve's implementation of the system. And also, it must defend the right to mine, own, and transact in digital assets. This will allow Idahoans to defend their financial liberties by opting out of a system poised to control and regulate their finances. Now, maybe that doesn't make sense to you, but again, if you're paying attention, if you see how few of your freedoms actually remain, financial freedom is one of the things you've got to have, and it's one of the surest ways to control people because we all need money in order to live and pay our bills. Now, Nicholas tells us, of course, Idaho's not the only state that could benefit from these policies, but now is the time for state legislatures to leverage this national momentum and consider how they can protect the finances of their constituents. Otherwise, they may find that the nation has left them behind on an issue where states are leading. This may be a bit much to take in all at once if you haven't considered it before. Or if you've dabbled in it, maybe it's time to commit and dive in head first and get your mind around what exactly is, what is cryptocurrency? What is Bitcoin? What isn't it? By the way, I would recommend, if you want to look this up, just use your favorite search engine to search up Tuttle Twins Explain Bitcoin. It's about a 20-minute long video, but it is remarkable in that it gives you so much information in a very easy to understand format. It's not dumbed down so much as it's just simplified for people who aren't familiar with what blockchain technology is, how cryptocurrency works, and how it eliminates the need for central banks to be there to affirm this transaction. And yes, in 3 to 5 business days, we can cash this check for you and so forth. It's not necessary. So it's something worth looking at. Well, some people will say it's still just digital imaginary currency, but you have to understand the value of Bitcoin is that there is a finite number of Bitcoin, meaning it's not something that can just be printed without limits like we're seeing now, which, by the way, is what's watering down the purchasing power of every dollar that you have. But it's also something that is not easy. You can't fake it. It's a permanent ledger that cannot be counterfeited. And that's where the value of cryptocurrency lies. I know it's scary. New things are scary, but it's something that's worth considering. One final note here, and then speaking of money and responsible use of money, I would like to encourage you to please go to idahofreedom.org/24pork. If you know of government waste in your city, county, school district, or some other unit of government, share your tips, and the Idaho Freedom Foundation researchers will do the digging. This is the Pork Report. It's back. And if you want to see responsible use of your money, here's a great chance to help compel some responsibility and accountability on the part of those in government. Again, idahofreedom.org/24pork. Yeah, I like money too. I love to get checks with my name on them. But if you're not paying attention to what is happening to our money system, and particularly the approach of that central bank digital currency, you're missing something that is really likely to impact your life, maybe for good, maybe not so good. But it's time to pay attention to it and become as informed as you possibly can. I'm Brian Hyde, and this is Nowhere to Hide.
Press Club or bias all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little